Rain lashed against the soot-darkened windows of Throgmorton Hall. A brooding estate crouched on the edge of Dartmoor, as if trying to retreat into the moor itself. The wind howled down the stone corridors like the moans of forgotten secrets. But within the library, all was silence until the butler's strangled gasp fractured it like a cracked mirror. Dotmer Lamplin, long-serving and stone-faced, stood rigid in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the figure slumped in the high-backed chair. Before the fireplace, Sir Reginald Fenchurch, patriarch of the Fenchurch estate, was unmistakably dead, his throat a gruesome wound, the poker from the hearth lying discarded near his feet. Blood had splattered the surrounding tartan rug in a semicircular spray. But what drew the eye more insistently was the strange positioning of the clock on the mantel above him. The ancient grandfather clock in the room was notoriously reliable, set daily by Sir Reginald himself with the diligence of a former naval officer. But now it read never, not midnight, not noon. The brass hands, both of them, had been physically removed and were nowhere to be found. Detective Inspector Gerald Hawthorne arrived by motorcar late that night, having been summoned by a telegram marked urgent. Even in the gloom, his sharp gray eyes took in everything as he entered the library where the scene had been left untouched, save for a blanket someone had thrown across Sir Reginald's lap, as though death could be comforted by wool. Who discovered the body? Hawthorne asked. Without looking at anyone in particular, I did, said Lamplin, with the dryness of someone who had practiced the lines. At precisely 7:14 in the evening, I had brought Sir Reginald his tea and found him thus. Hawthorne turned, his gaze slicing through the butler and the rest of the house. Lady Fenchurch was in the conservatory, with Dr. Percival, her bridge partner. Miss Iona, Sir Reginald's niece, was reading in her bedroom. Mr. Giles, the solicitor, was expected, but hadn't yet arrived. The staff were in the kitchen. Anyone else have access to this room? No, sir. It is locked from the inside. When in use, only Sir Reginald had the key. Hawthorne moved toward the body. The poker was indeed stained, but not bent. No defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. Sir Reginald's expression was not one of surprise or terror, but a mild confusion, as if he hadn't seen it coming, or hadn't cared. What disturbed Hawthorne more was the mantelpiece clock. The hands removed, no fragments nearby, no signs of force. He crouched to examine the casing. Clean, no scratches, no prints. And the clock had been stopped, not merely broken, but deliberately silenced. The gears had been wound tightly to a halt. Curious, he murmured. Why would someone silence a clock that had already struck once? There was no immediate answer. The doctor confirmed the time of death as between 6:45 and 7 p.m., placing it moments before Lamplin's arrival. A single blow to the neck, deliberate, practiced, not a crime of passion. Someone had known precisely what they were doing. Upstairs, Miss Iona trembled slightly as she recounted her evening. I was reading Middlemarch, she said, gesturing toward a book with a red ribbon at page 312. I'd spoken with Uncle earlier that day. He seemed anxious. He kept saying he had something to reveal, something that couldn't wait. But he wouldn't say what. Hawthorne noted this, then asked about the clock. Her brow furrowed. The hands? That's horrible. Uncle always said the clock was the heartbeat of the room. He couldn't sleep if it ticked even a second off. Back. Downstairs, Giles the solicitor arrived, his coat dripping and his face pale. I'm late, he admitted. There was a message to meet Sir Reginald urgently. Said it was a matter of inheritance. Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. You have the note? No, it was a phone call. From whom? I assumed it was Sir Reginald. He only said, come. Before 8, everything changes tonight. Now there was a wrinkle. Sir Reginald planning a dramatic reveal, contacting both his solicitor and niece with cryptic suggestions. A man burdened by secrets, a man preparing to unsettle the order of things. The motive was beginning to form. Hawthorne reviewed the locked room again. No signs of forced entry. The windows bolted, the servants' access closed, the only key still in the dead man's pocket. But the silence of the clock gnawed at him. Time, he thought. The killer had tampered with time. He asked for a list of guests who had ever stayed in Throgmorton Hall, and soon the library's secretary returned with Records, among them was a name that snagged Hawthorne's eye: Dr. Percival Danner. Hawthorne returned to the conservatory. "Doctor, you play bridge with Lady Fenchurch?" "Yes, every evening since last autumn." "Before that?" He hesitated. "I was abroad." "Strange," Hawthorne said, folding his hands. "You were mentioned in a 1922 letter from Sir Reginald, warning his solicitor to bar you from future entry. Something about Monte Carlo. Debts, lies." Dr. Percival's face lost its color. "Old wounds," he muttered. "Reginald forgave me." Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Forgave you, or needed to watch you." The seeds of the crime had been planted years before. He was beginning to see a dishonor buried, a betrayal excused on the surface, but not forgotten. And yet the clue remained. Why remove the hands of the clock? Only once everyone had left the room did Hawthorne sit before the fireplace himself. He stared at the mantel, lips pressed. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he reached into the small wooden box of firelighters. There, tucked between kindling and wax cubes, he pulled free to thin brass clock hands, both stained faintly with oil and something darker. They had not been taken for symbolism. They had been hidden hastily. He turned them over. On the longer one, barely visible in the light, were scratched the letters: Iona Daphne. No, impossible. She'd seemed shaken, sincere. Then it struck him. Iona had not left her room. But someone could have entered. A final detail surfaced: a faint scent of expensive cigar smoke in the hallway outside her room. The only man in the house known for cigars was Sir Reginald himself. But there was another guest, Dr. Percival Danner, and that explained it. Sir Reginald had summoned his solicitor and niece to announce a change, a new will. Perhaps cutting Percival out or revealing some past crime. The doctor had intercepted Iona, perhaps to persuade her, perhaps to silence her if she knew too much. But ultimately, it was Sir Reginald he had gone to. Perhaps there was one final plea. Perhaps it ended in fury. But the removal of the hands, that was panic. Percival knew Reginald always watched the clock. Perhaps it had struck once as the blow fell. That chime would tie the time too closely to him. He had stopped the hands, removed them, and hidden them before slipping away through the dumbwaiter shaft behind the wine cabinet, an old servant's trick he would have learned years ago when staying at the estate. The locked room, no longer a puzzle. The silence of time, now a confession. Hawthorne folded the brass hands into his pocket and rose to make the arrest. Detective Inspector Gerald Hawthorne did not arrest Dr. Danner immediately. A theory, no matter how compelling, was not proof. An instinct, though vital, had to be fed by something more concrete than scratched initials and misplaced time. Instead, he left the library with a careful neutrality. The clock hands nestled discreetly in his coat pocket. His boots echoed softly down the stone corridor as he made his way to the drawing room, where the remaining members of the household had been gathered under the watchful eye of Sergeant Miles. The mood was brittle. Lady Fenchurch, imperious even, in grief, sat upright on the settee, her long fingers clasped around a delicate glass of sherry. Iona, quiet but visibly fraying, had taken refuge beside the hearth. Dr. Danner, cool as a frostbitten lake, stood by the drinks cabinet, pouring himself a neat scotch as though the evening's events were merely a diversion. Giles, the solicitor, paced the edge of the room like a man afraid of stillness. "Forgive me for the intrusion," Hawthorne said, letting the door click softly behind him. "But there are a few details still troubling me. They may seem trivial, but it's often the smallest stitch that binds or unravels the whole." He let that hang a moment before his gaze moved slowly round the room. No one met it. "I'd like to start with a simple question," he continued. "Did any of you hear the clock strike?" Lady Fenchurch raised an arched brow. "Which clock?" "There are at least 6 in this house. The one in the library," he said. "The grandfather clock. You all know it well." Iona blinked. "It strikes every hour," she said slowly. "It always has. Uncle used a joke he liked hearing time march on." But tonight, Hawthorne pressed. They exchanged uncertain glances. Giles shook his head. Dr. Danner was the only one who spoke. "I heard it strike once, round 6:45, I believe. I remember because it startled Lady Fenchurch. We'd just finished the second rubber." Hawthorne turned to the widow. She stiffened. "If I was startled, it wasn't by the clock." Perhaps the wind. But Hawthorne noted the tremor in her hand as she set down the glass. He was also noting something else, something that had tugged at him earlier but hadn't yet come into focus. He crossed to the window. It was ajar. Just a sliver. The wind slipped through with a gentle moan. Curious, he reached out and closed it. This window, was it open before tonight? Lady Fenchurch frowned. Certainly not. The draft would ruin the carpet. One of the staff, perhaps. One of the staff, Hawthorne repeated mildly, though they've all sworn they were in the kitchen, preparing supper. No one's admitted to setting foot in this room after 4 p.m. He let that sit, then slowly scanned the mantel. There was a porcelain shepherdess, dainty and faintly absurd, a pair of silver candle holders, and a framed photograph, Sir Reginald and Iona, standing stiffly beside a mounted deer, both looking equally unimpressed. Something was wrong. Hawthorne leaned closer. The dust, the fine layer across the entire mantel, was undisturbed except where the frame sat. He reached out and shifted it. Beneath, a faint square of cleaner surface marked where the photo had originally rested, only now it had been moved 2 inches to the right. Someone had disturbed it recently, and not just the photograph. On the floor below it, barely visible in the firelight, was a tiny shard of glass. No one had mentioned broken glass. He crouched. It was from a watch face, not the mantel clock. Its glass was intact. This was something smaller, personal, a man's timepiece. Sir Reginald wore a watch, didn't he? He asked without turning. Of course, said Iona softly. He kept it in his waistcoat pocket, always, when the body was found. Did anyone notice it? No one answered. But now Hawthorne turned. It's missing. A hush fell like a sheet. Even Dr. Danner stiffened slightly. Odd, Hawthorne mused. Wealthy man, antique timepiece. One of a kind, no doubt. Yet it vanishes during a locked room. Murder, oddest of all. It shatters, quietly, deliberately. He stepped closer to Danner, whose fingers tensed around his glass. Tell me, Doctor, when you heard the clock strike once, you were in the conservatory. That's right. Facing which direction? Danner blinked. North. And yet the conservatory's walls are all glass, meaning the sound you heard didn't come from the library clock. Danner opened his mouth to speak, but Hawthorne cut across him. The library clock chimes toward the south hallway only. I verified it myself this morning. But the garden gate has a smaller bell mechanism, one Sir Reginald had installed in case visitors entered. Through the hedge path, a single chime. You didn't hear the clock, Doctor. You heard someone arriving. Danner's silence was sudden and total. I wonder, Hawthorne continued, if Sir Reginald's watch was broken in a scuffle. Perhaps when someone grabbed his arm too quickly, or pushed him, or maybe, just maybe, he broke it himself. A final act, an attempt to leave a message. He reached into his pocket and drew out the brass clock hands, because he'd already planned to make time speak for him. Only someone tried to stop it. There was a flicker in Iona's face, then surprise, followed by an emotion harder to name. I didn't know, she said. I didn't know about the hands. I believe you, Hawthorne said gently. But someone in this room knew what Sir Reginald planned, knew he meant to reveal something, to change a will, to expose a past treachery. Dr. Danner gave a brittle smile. You've painted a compelling theory, Inspector. But where is your evidence? Hawthorne didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he turned to Giles. You were summoned to. What time was your meeting meant to be? 8 o'clock sharp, the solicitor said. Sir Reginald said he would have documents to sign. Documents, Hawthorne echoed. Perhaps naming Iona as the sole heir. Perhaps disinheriting someone else entirely. He let the air thicken for a long moment. Then he said, very softly, the question is no longer who had reason to kill Sir Reginald. The question is who knew that their time was already running out. And then, almost as an afterthought, he turned to Sergeant Miles. Check the doctor's coat, if you please. I suspect we'll find a broken watch, perhaps wrapped in a handkerchief, and if we're lucky, with traces of the same oil used to lubricate the mantel clock. The room fractured in noise. Lady Fenchurch's gasp, Giles' sudden oath, Iona's startled half-cry, but it was Dr. Danner's expression that gave Hawthorne what he truly needed. A flicker of panic, followed by a smile that came 1 second, Too late. Sergeant Miles, a broad man whose every movement seemed to carry the certainty of law, stepped forward and silently extended a hand toward Dr. Danner. For a moment, the doctor didn't move. His eyes, steely and calm just moments before, darted between the inspector, the sergeant, and the others, calculating something. Then, with a sigh that felt almost like resignation, he unbuttoned his coat and handed it over. The garment was thick, finely tailored, and carried the faint scent of tobacco and bergamot. Miles searched methodically, first one pocket, then another. A penknife, a monogrammed handkerchief, finally in the inner lining. Wrapped in a silk kerchief embroidered with the Danner crest was the object they expected. A shattered gold watch. It had no glass, no hands, and a hairline fracture through its face. The second hand was jammed just past the 5. Hawthorne said nothing at first, merely turning the watch in his palm like a priest reading scripture. "You wouldn't happen to have an explanation for this, Doctor?" "I dropped it," Danner said evenly, "earlier this afternoon, on the gravel path outside. Must have cracked then." "Odd," Hawthorne murmured, "that it smells faintly of lamp oil, the same oil used in the library clock's gears. I found a smear of it on the floor, just below the mantel. That proves nothing." Danner snapped, "You've built a story, not a case." "Perhaps," Hawthorne allowed. "Let's test its strength, then." He turned to Iona. She looked pale, her eyes darkened by exhaustion or dread, he couldn't yet tell which. "Miss Fenchurch, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" The others didn't protest. Iona followed him into the smaller morning room, a sunlit place by day, now gray and cavernous under the weight of evening. She took the seat he offered, but twisted, her hands in her lap with visible tension. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Hawthorne said gently, "but I believe you know more than you've said. Something about the sequence of events tonight, or perhaps something that happened before tonight." She hesitated. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper. Uncle Reginald didn't trust Dr. Danner. He never did. But he allowed him back into the house because of Lady Fenchurch. "Ah. So there was more between them than bridge games and polite dinners?" She nodded. "They were close before she married my uncle." "I think," it resumed, quietly, "but he didn't love her, not really. He wanted the estate. And when Uncle started talking about changing the will, about putting everything in my name, I think Dr. Danner overheard." Hawthorne leaned forward. "Did he threaten you?" "No. But I found a letter in Uncle's study a few days ago, not addressed, just sitting out. It said, 'If the papers are signed, I'll see you buried before your timepiece.'" Her breath caught. "It was in Danner's hand. I burned it. I was frightened. Why not tell me earlier?" She shook her head. "Because if you couldn't prove it, I didn't want to make it worse." The inspector sat back, absorbing this. "Did you see or hear anything else unusual tonight?" She hesitated, then said slowly, "I thought I heard someone arguing, round 6:30. I was in my room. It was faint through the floorboards, Uncle's voice, and someone else. I couldn't make out the words. That put the confrontation at 15 minutes before the estimated time of death. Tight timing, but it fit." He returned with her to the drawing room, where the atmosphere had cooled into something brittle and waiting. Dr. Danner, now seated stiffly, no longer held the relaxed air of a guest. Giles was nursing a drink with exaggerated calm, while Lady Fenchurch seemed sculpted from stone. Hawthorne turned to her next. "Lady Fenchurch, might we speak alone?" She rose with a slight lift of the chin, gliding ahead of him into the conservatory. The glass walls trembled softly with the wind outside. "Your husband's death is a tragedy," Hawthorne began, "but it's clear his intentions before his death were causing waves in the household. I understand you and Dr. Danner were once close." She narrowed her eyes. "Inspector, is this a moral inquiry or a criminal one?" "Criminal," he said plainly. She laughed dry and brief. "Reginald always wanted order, everything filed, boxed, labeled. That includes people. He resented my friendships. He resented my past. He especially resented Percival." "Did he confront you about him recently?" "Only last week," she said. "After dinner, he told me he was making corrections to his will. I asked what he meant. He only said, 'By next Tuesday, you'll have what you deserve.'" Her tone was neutral, but Hawthorne caught the slight curl of her lip. Did you share this with Dr. Danner? No, she lied too quickly. He waited. Finally, she sighed. I may have mentioned the will, in passing, yesterday. Did he ask questions? She stared at the glass. He asked how much I stood to lose. That sounds like motive. She turned to him, something cold and sharp flickering behind her expression. If you think Percival killed Reginald, arrest him. If you're looking for certainty, you won't find it here. In this house, loyalty doesn't come unspoiled. Back in the drawing room, Giles had poured another measure of whiskey and greeted Hawthorne with a dry smile. May I assume I'm next on your list of quiet interrogations? He asked. You may, said Hawthorne, and they took the short walk to the library, silent now, but still heavy with the weight of blood and time. Mr. Giles, how well did you know Sir Reginald? Well enough to advise him not to invite Danner back into his affairs, the solicitor said, adjusting his cuffs, and not well enough for him to take my advice. What did you come to discuss tonight? The new will. He hinted there'd be a significant redistribution. Did he mention who was being cut out? No, but he was holding back something. A final twist. That was his style. Where were you between 6 and 7? On the road. I arrived at 7:10. Can anyone confirm? My driver, Humphreys. He dropped me at the gate. Did you go directly to the library? No. I saw the door was shut. I came inside, found Lamplin in the hallway, and within minutes we heard the commotion. Hawthorne nodded, then glanced at the bookshelf. A few volumes were slightly out of place, as though something had recently been removed or stuffed behind them. A quick inspection confirmed it a small brass key, coated in dust, but recently disturbed. Do you know what this opens? Giles peered at it. Looks like the drawer in Reginald's writing desk. The inspector moved swiftly. He opened the drawer and found only one item inside, a single-page letter. It read, to whom it may concern, should I be found dead, know this was no accident. There's one among us who plays with time and poison, who speaks softly and strikes swiftly. The clock does not lie. Ask the woman who guards the hourglass. R.F. Hawthorne folded the letter slowly, mind churning. There were truths buried here, and warnings still unfaced. One thing was clear: every voice in the house had been altered by deception, but now one had begun to unravel. He just needed to decide whose. Hawthorne stood alone in the library again, the letter from the drawer still in his hand, its final line echoing in his mind. Ask the woman who guards the hourglass. The metaphor seemed deliberate, too deliberate. For a dying man to choose at random, Sir Reginald had been methodical to the end. His words were never poetic unless it suited a purpose. This was a breadcrumb, left not in panic, but with calculation. The woman, the hourglass. Not a literal object, Hawthorne suspected, but symbolic. Who among them guarded time, controlled it, measured it, perhaps twisted it? He thought of Lady Fenchurch, elegant, composed, aging but not without bitterness. She had lived for years in Reginald's shadow, and from what Iona implied, she'd been kept on a tight leash, tolerated but not truly trusted. Dr. Danner's return must have rekindled old embers, but it was just as likely that Lady Fenchurch had her own designs. Then again, Iona herself young, seemingly innocent, but the sole potential heir to a fortune about to be legally confirmed. Reginald's change of will, set for that very evening, might have left her with everything or with nothing, had it not been finalized. Giles, the solicitor, had claimed ignorance, but a lawyer stood always at the crossroads of secrets, and Dr. Danner, already cornered by circumstance and damning clues, still hadn't broken. He remained too calm, too measured, too knowing. Hawthorne returned to the drawing room where the suspects waited, their silences deepening into a tension that thickened the air. He addressed them as a group this time, letting the room itself do part of the interrogation. Everyone here had motive, he said quietly, and more than one kind. Greed, fear, old wounds. But no single story explains all the facts, so let's pull the knots apart. He turned to Giles. You had the most to lose if Sir Reginald exposed malpractice, financial irregularities in the estates. Books don't deny it. I found his annotations. Margins squeezed in places only a clever man with a red pen could have arranged. Giles stiffened. He accused, yes, but never proved anything. and I had no reason to kill him. I stood to lose more from his death. Without his signature on the new documents, the estate remains in limbo, and I'm still executor, unless you forged the final draft and hoped to push it through posthumously," Hawthorne said coolly. "You're capable of that, aren't you?" Giles didn't reply. The inspector turned next to Lady Fenchurch. "You knew about the will. You also knew Reginald suspected Danner of ambition beyond charm. But you never tried to stop him from returning. Why?" She gave him a long, measuring look. "Because I wanted him here. For protection," Hawthorne asked. "No, for temptation," she said. "I wanted to see if he still desired what he once did. Me or the inheritance." Reginald used him as a gauge, Inspector, like some ghastly test. But the game backfired. I saw Percival's heart clearer than ever. And did that make you love him more? It made me realize he never loved anyone. Dr. Danner smirked faintly, but said nothing. Hawthorne shifted his attention. "And you, Doctor, what were you promised or threatened with?" "I was neither promised nor threatened," Danner said. "Reginald and I had unfinished business. I hoped he'd let it go. He didn't." "You came back expecting forgiveness," Hawthorne said, "but found a man ready to close the door on you entirely. You feared not just loss of influence, but exposure." "I don't fear exposure," Danner said evenly. "I fear stagnation." Reginald represented the past, clinging to it like a dying vine. I wanted him to see that his future could be more flexible, a future that included you at its center. Danner tilted his head, but said nothing. "And then there's Miss Iona," Hawthorne continued, his tone gentler now. "You had nothing but kindness from your uncle, but he was also controlling, wasn't he?" She nodded faintly. "He took you and protected you, but you were never really free." "Did he ever tell you what would happen after the will was signed?" She bit her lip, and her voice came low. "He said I'd be the custodian, that I'd inherit, but only if I kept the estate exactly as it was. No changes, no sales, no charities. He wanted me to live as he did, in his memory. So even his gift came with chains. I loved him," she said, "but sometimes I wished that I didn't owe him anything." Silence followed her words. Not one person in the room seemed untouched by resentment. Each had been offered something precious and found it poisoned. "You see now," Hawthorne said. "Each of you had reason. Each of you wanted something from Reginald he wouldn't give, and the only thing that bound him was time." He turned back to Lady Fenchurch, his voice narrowing. "You guard the hourglass." She blinked. "You control the household routines, the dinner bells, the curfew, the order of rooms. You, not Lamplin, hold the true schedule of this house. And when Reginald began planning changes, I believe you noticed the shift first." "I did," she said carefully. "You noticed he was meeting with Giles more often, writing at night, sealing envelopes. You knew something irreversible was coming and not in your favor. I didn't kill him, perhaps not, but perhaps you made it easier for someone who would. A delayed dinner, a closed-off corridor, a key left out. None of it would have seemed odd unless planned." She said nothing, but the color had drained from her cheeks. "And Danner, if you didn't strike the final blow, you certainly provoked the confrontation. You feared being erased." "I didn't kill him," Danner said softly, "but I argued. I threatened to leave again, unless he changed course. I was bluffing, and when he refused, I stormed out. I went to the stables to cool off. Can anyone confirm that?" "No." Hawthorne turned to Giles. "And you, I think you delayed on purpose, arrived just after 7, knowing you might avoid being the last witness to see Reginald alive. But I believe you were here earlier than you claimed." "I was not." The gardener saw a figure enter the west gate just before dusk. "It wasn't Dan, a wrong coat, but it could have been you." Again, Giles said nothing. "This is the maze," Hawthorne said. "Everyone played a part, but who pulled the thread that caused the rest to snap?" Then he reached into his coat and placed the broken watch on the table. "This was stopped at 6:47, the time of death, and its hands were taken afterwards. Only someone still in the room could have done that. Someone who lingered, perhaps to check for documents, or hide the weapon, or tamper with the clock." He stared at each of them. "I don't need everyone's guilt. Just one moment of honesty. That's all it takes to unlock the rest." And in the next moment, He saw it a flicker in Iona's eyes. Not guilt, but terror. She looked not at him, but at the corner of the room, at something just beyond the FIRELIGHT dot, and then she whispered, "It wasn't supposed to go like that." Hawthorne's breath stilled. He knew then. She hadn't struck the blow, but she had seen it, and protected the one who had. Iona's whisper rippled across the room like a crack in glass, too soft to draw conclusions, too raw to ignore. Hawthorne stepped forward, watching the way her eyes stayed locked on that shadowed corner near the drinks cabinet. Not daring to meet anyone else's gaze, everyone turned toward her then, expectant. But she didn't speak again. Her lips had sealed over whatever truth she had been about to let slip before Hawthorne could press her. The door opened and Sergeant Miles entered briskly, a paper in his hand and a smudge of satisfaction on his face. "Inspector," he said, with the solemnity of someone delivering good news, "to a room unaccustomed to it, we've found something hidden in the doctor's traveling case." All eyes shifted to Danner. Miles approached with a sealed evidence bag. Inside, nestled against crushed tissue and silk lining, was a flat-bladed letter opener, ornate, with a handle shaped like a serpent eating its own tail. It had been wiped clean, but Hawthorne could see, even through the plastic, the edge still bore the faint stain of something dried and brownish red. The cleaner confirmed it. Miles continued, "That letter opener was kept in the library's side drawer. Dr. Danner must have taken it." Danner's face remained unreadable. "That case has been in the guest room since I arrived. Anyone could have planted it there." "Come now," Giles muttered, his tone sharpened by vindication. "This is getting absurd." "No," Lady Fenchurch said, coldly elegant. "It's beginning to make sense." But Hawthorne wasn't so quick to agree. He stepped forward, took the bag, and examined the blade closely. "Sir Reginald's wound," he said quietly, "was blunt force trauma to the throat. Crushing, not slicing. A weapon like this, it's sharp. This would leave a very different signature. Perhaps he used it first," Giles offered, "then switched to the poker. Perhaps." Hawthorne echoed, his tone distant. "But why use two weapons when one would suffice? Especially in a locked room. That's not improvisation. That's performance." He looked up at Danner. "Do you recognize it?" "I've seen it." "Yes," Danner said. "It was already in the library. I didn't touch it, but someone did," Miles interjected. "It was found among your belongings." Hawthorne sighed and turned slowly toward the rest. "We're being handed a solution, and it's neat. Too neat. That weapon may have been moved, but not by the killer. This feels like sleight of hand, a distraction. But the clock," Lady Fenchurch insisted, "and the watch, yes." Hawthorne interrupted, "And they all point toward a staged scene. Someone wanted us to think Danner committed this murder, which means if it wasn't him, we're chasing a phantom while the real hand tightens its grip behind us." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It vibrated with uncertainty, with shifting guilt. Miles frowned. "Still, sir, the brass clock hands and that broken watch, you said yourself." "I said Danner had motive and opportunity, but I never said he was the killer." A moment passed, then another. Iona rose from her chair abruptly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. "I need air." She crossed the room with a hand pressed to her lips and disappeared into the hall. No one followed. Hawthorne watched her go, mind turning over the events with growing disquiet. The false weapon planted, the too convenient trail, the hush that had fallen over the household too quickly after the murder. There were other voices still unaccounted for, servants, overlooked staff, and especially Lamplin, who had faded into the background after discovering the body. He asked Miles to keep watch on Danner, then made his way out into the hall, following Iona's footsteps toward the conservatory. He found her standing near the outer door, wrapped in a thin shawl, staring into the rain-glossed garden. Her shoulders were hunched not from cold, but from something heavier. "You saw what happened," he said gently, "didn't you?" She didn't turn, but he saw her hands tighten. "You weren't meant to," he added. "You walked in too early, or too late. Maybe you heard it, not saw it. But you know who did it." I didn't mean to lie," she said, her voice cracking. "I just didn't want it to ruin everything. Uncle Reginald could be cruel, Inspector. He kept people on a leash and called it care. "Iona," he said, stepping beside her. "Tell me what you saw." Her lips parted, then closed again. The sound of rain filled the silence. And finally, she spoke. "I heard voices in the library. I knew something was wrong. I heard the chime, and then shouting. When I reached the door, it was open, just slightly. Uncle was slumped in the chair, and someone was standing over him. Not moving, just staring." She stopped, swallowed. "It was Lamplin." Hawthorne blinked. "Lamplin, the butler? I thought it was shock," she whispered. He looked frozen. Then he turned, saw me, and suddenly, it was like a mask went back on. "He told me to go back to my room, said he'd handle it. I didn't question it. He'd always been there, reliable. I thought maybe he was trying to help, to cover for someone. But when the poker was placed, the hands gone from the clock, I realized someone had cleaned the scene, and who else could move through this house unseen?" The pattern shifted in Hawthorne's mind then. Not a rage killing, not a desperate act, a cold correction. He returned to the drawing room with haste, but calm in his step. Miles looked up expectantly. "Sergeant, where's Lamplin?" Miles frowned, said he was fetching tea. "That was 20 minutes ago." Hawthorne turned to the others. "Stay here." He moved quickly now, deeper into the house past the familiar corridors and into the service wing. It was colder here, less adorned, silent. Then, from a side room, he saw a flicker of motion, a light extinguished. He pushed the door open. The pantry was empty, save for one thing, Lamplin's coat, folded neatly on a chair. On top, an envelope. Inside, a single page, in perfect script. "Forgive me. I have always served this house, but some clocks must stop, so others can begin." He was going to cut Iona out entirely. He was going to burn it all to the ground. "I did. Not kill for gain. I killed for justice. Let the hands remain lost." Below, a second note shorter, almost like an afterthought. "By the time you read this, I will be past the moor wall. You will not find me. Let the house be free." Hawthorne read it twice, then folded it slowly and returned to the others. Danner looked up as he entered, still guarded, but now faintly expectant. "I assume," he said, "you've found your real murderer." Hawthorne nodded. "Yes." Lady Fenchurch looked stunned. "Who?" "The man who saw everything, knew everything, and was always on time." The others sat back, relieved, bewildered. It had the air of resolution. But Hawthorne wasn't fooled. A confession, yes, a disappearance, an answer wrapped in a loyal servant's name. But something was still wrong. The note was neat, and something in Iona's expression, when he returned the folded coat, was not sorrow. It was relief. The house quieted after the revelation, or what passed for one. The others accepted Lamplin's note like a key finally turned in a stiff lock. Dr. Danner reclined with forced grace, as if vindication were something owed to him all along. Lady Fenchurch poured herself another glass of sherry without tremor. Even Giles had shed the look of a cornered fox. Only Iona remained apart, her relief folded neatly inside her silence. But Hawthorne wasn't finished. He stood again in the library, alone this time, turning the envelope over in his hand. The handwriting was perfect. Lamplin had been a meticulous man, yes, but his service records showed a hand shaped by years of polish and wear, not the smooth symmetry of the lines now before him. And the phrasing, "Let the house be free," it rang false like theater. He returned to the desk, opening its lower drawer. There, tucked beneath layers of ink-stained blotter pads, he found Sir Reginald's correspondence files. Dull as death at first glance, receipts, clipped letters, tax forms. But in the back, bound in twine, was a collection of personal missives, and one stood out immediately, a letter dated 12 years ago, signed by Reginald Fenchurch and addressed to a man named Whitcombe. It began without pleasantries. "I write this not for reconciliation, but for record. You and I both know what was done. The silence of the court did not clear your conscience. I allowed the settlement because I wished to spare my niece the press. I made her forget, but I did not. If you so much as step foot in Yorkshire again, I will open the ledger. I will make sure every door closes to you. And if I die before that happens, This letter will ensure someone else opens it. Hawthorne read it again. Whitcombe. The name echoed. He turned toward the shelves. Reginald had kept bound casebooks, legal, personal, public. He scanned them swiftly until a slim volume revealed what he sought. Cumberland trial records. 1911, 1915. And there, buried in a footnote, estate fraud, Pendlebrook. Dismissed under sealed settlement. Reginald Fenchurch witness versus Ernest Whitcombe defendant. Pendlebrook. That wasn't just a property name, it was Iona's childhood home. The old hunting estate the family sold off after the war. And Ernest Whitcombe. That name wasn't just from legal pages. Hawthorne stepped back, heart ticking a little faster. He opened the note from Lamplin again. The ink was black standard. The folds were tight, and the signature unsigned. Merely a name at the bottom, printed plainly. But what stood out now was this. Nowhere in the letter did Lamplin admit to the murder. Not plainly. No weapon. No exact description. Just inference. A mask. Just like the one Iona had watched slip into place. He returned to her room. It was as neat as before. Spare. Controlled. A painting hung above the desk. Sunlit hills. Riders in red. Understated and meaningless unless you knew the place. And now Hawthorne did. Pendlebrook. The brush style was old, but something about the detail of one of the riders, the tilt of the chin, the sweep of dark hair sent a cold certainty through him. He stepped to her desk. The writing blotter was clean, but when he peeled it back, he found a scrap of thin notepaper beneath a testing draft of ink strokes, several loops, a few words written again and again. Free the house. Free the house. Let it breathe. Not Lamplin's hand. Hers. She had written the letter. She had framed Lamplin, and she had done it not alone. When he returned to the drawing room, the air had warmed. Danner was seated beside her now, closer than before. Her posture was no longer frightened but poised, safe. Giles and Lady Fenchurch were still discussing estate matters like the weather had cleared. Hawthorne didn't speak at first. He simply placed the letter from Reginald on the table. I'd like to read something aloud. He read it in full, watching as each face registered something different. Giles looked blank, unaware. Lady Fenchurch twitched at the phrase "make her forget." Danner's expression did not change, but Iona's did. Not fear, recognition. And then he placed the unsigned note, Lamplin's supposed confession, beside it. Then the ink scrap. Then, at last, the painting taken from her room. "You've all been trying to solve the crime of tonight," he said softly. "But this murder began a long time ago." Danner stood, voice calm. "Inspector, no." Hawthorne said, You knew who she really was when you first arrived. Not Iona Fenchurch, niece of a Yorkshire baron, but Iona Whitcombe, daughter of Ernest Whitcombe." Lady Fenchurch gasped. "I suspect even Reginald only discovered the connection recently." Hawthorne continued, "Why else rush to rewrite the will? Why else write a letter like this one that references something buried for over a decade?" He turned to Iona. "You didn't just want freedom from his control. You wanted revenge. For your father. For the life you believed Reginald stole." Iona's jaw trembled but didn't open. "And you didn't act alone," Hawthorne said, turning finally to Danner. "You were the bridge. You met her years ago, perhaps at university, or a charity gala, maybe even under another name, but you knew who she was. And when the opportunity came to insert yourself into the Fenchurch household again, you took it." Danner gave a slow nod, almost admiring. "You've done well, Inspector, but not well enough." Hawthorne replied, "Unless you tell me who swung the poker." Danner looked at Iona. She didn't look back. Instead, she turned her eyes on Hawthorne. "He didn't kill him," she said. "He helped," Hawthorne replied. "He cleaned it up, hid the hands, maybe even planted the weapon in his own bag to be the scapegoat. But he didn't strike the blow." She said nothing, but the look that passed between them then was no longer masked. It was honest and devastating. "I did," she said softly, and the room froze. "I waited in the study," she said. "He was meant to meet Giles at 8, but he came in earlier, looking for the letter. I asked him one last time, just acknowledge what he did to my father. He refused. He said I was lucky he let us disappear quietly. He said I owed him. Her voice hardened. I saw the poker near the hearth. I didn't plan it, but it wasn't an accident. She stepped forward. It wasn't justice either. I told myself it was, but it was revenge. Danner's voice broke the silence. I begged her to let it go, but I understood. Hawthorne looked at them both, the web complete now. Not clean, but whole. You were never supposed to be caught. He said, no, Iona admitted, only misdirected. She turned to Lady Fenchurch. I wrote the letter. I forged Lamplin's name, because he would have done anything for this house. And I needed someone who would take suspicion with grace. She swallowed, and now I have to do the same. The room had fallen into a silence so complete that even the fire dared not crackle. Iona stood before them with her confession lying open between her lips. And yet Hawthorne remained still. He didn't call for handcuffs, didn't reach for Sergeant Miles, not yet. There was something off. Her voice had been steady, too steady. Not like someone carrying the weight of a murder long buried beneath rehearsed layers of guilt. It sounded almost rehearsed. Danner's silence beside her confirmed it. His gaze hadn't flickered once, not with fear, not with guilt, only loyalty. Absolute and unwavering. He was protecting her, or she was protecting him, or perhaps both were protecting someone else entirely. And the more he thought about it, the less sense the scene made. The timing, the poker, the clock hands removed, the forged confession. These weren't the gestures of a woman driven to impulsive revenge. They were calculated misdirections. Every detail had been placed angled toward a narrative that pointed everywhere, except where it should. He needed to break the rhythm, something outside procedure, something that pierced through polished lies, without a word. Hawthorne walked over to the fireplace and picked up the small brass mantel clock, its hollow face mocking him with its silence. He turned it over, revealing the missing hands, and gently set it on the center table. Then he removed from his pocket the shattered watch found in Danner's coat, the one everyone had quietly accepted as incidental. He placed it beside the clock. I'd like to try something, he said quietly, more to himself than the room. He reached into the side cabinet and withdrew a third timepiece, Lady Fenchurch's wristwatch, which he had earlier noted lying by the phonograph, its clasp broken. 3 broken timepieces, he said, all in this house. All stopped. He looked around. I want everyone to write down privately what time they believe they heard the clock chime. They stared at him. The chime, he repeated. You all heard it. Once, maybe faintly. But you remember it. Write the hour you think it struck. He handed out cards silently, like a conjurer preparing for a trick. One by one, they wrote. No one spoke. No one asked why. When he gathered the cards, he read each aloud. Lady Fenchurch, 7 o'clock. Giles, 6:45. Danner, round 6:50. Iona, 6:30. He said nothing, just looked at the cards again. Interesting, he murmured, because I found soot on the chime lever. Someone struck it manually. The clock hadn't been wound in weeks. It wouldn't have chimed on its own. Giles frowned. So someone wanted to fake a time of death, not just fake it, Hawthorne said. Control it, create confusion, fix memory around a noise. He looked at Danner. You said you were outside when the chime rang. You timed your story around it. But if the chime was faked, then your timeline falls apart. And yours? Danner asked softly. Is it ironclad? No, but it isn't held together with thread and theater either. He turned to Iona. 6:30, he said. Why? So early? I was in my room, she said. I thought I heard it, just before voices downstairs. Interesting, Hawthorne repeated, because the gardener heard no chime at all. He was out trimming by the east lawn between 6:30 and 7, said the library window was open, said he'd have heard it if it rang. Danner's jaw tightened. Hawthorne tapped the shattered watch gently. You see, I believe this was planted not to frame Danner, but to frame time itself. A broken watch, a clock with its hands stolen, a chime heard by some, not all. The killer didn't just commit murder, they tried to fracture memory, bend it. He walked toward Lady Fenchurch and studied her face. You changed your story, you know. First you said Reginald died near dinner. Then later you said the chime marked his death. Why the shift? I was mistaken. No. You were clever and panicked. When you realized the chime was faked, you tried to pin it to dinner, to align with Danner's guilt. But you couldn't hold the lie, because you knew the truth. Her face whitened. I don't know what you're suggesting. I'm suggesting you were the one who broke the clock. That's absurd. No, it's not, because I found the hands hidden in the bottom of your embroidery box. He dropped a small cloth-wrapped bundle onto the table. When he unwrapped it, the brass clock hands gleamed dully against the fabric. She gasped, but not with outrage, with fear. Iona turned to her slowly, eyes widening. You, she whispered. But Lady Fenchurch didn't answer. Hawthorne did. Sir. Reginald's death wasn't an impulsive blow from a wronged niece. It was a silencing, a final act of control from a woman whose influence was being steadily drained. Danner had returned. Reginald was rewriting the will. The household was shifting. And in your mind, all of it, everything was slipping away. Lady Fenchurch backed away from the table. No, you have no proof. I do, he said calmly. In your journal. The one hidden behind the phonograph. You wrote something last. Week an entry that read, "He intends to unmake me, but time obeys me, not him." A strange phrase, but perfectly in character. He stepped forward. You staged the murder to point at everyone else. You rang the chime by hand. You planted the watch in Danner's bag. You forged Lamplin's confession, and had Iona find it, knowing her guilt and fear would shield you from suspicion. You broke your own wristwatch and left it near the phonograph, hoping it would suggest a scuffle. Lady Fenchurch's hands were trembling now. You knew the only thing more powerful than truth was memory, so you bent memory broke it like a clock face and fed us stories. Her composure cracked, just slightly. I only wanted the house, she said. I built this life, every inch of it. He was going to take it all away, give it to a girl who barely knew him, strip me of everything I'd endured. And so, Hawthorne said softly, you stripped him of breath. No one moved. Iona stood, frozen. Danner closed his eyes briefly. Then, slowly, Lady Fenchurch reached for her shawl. I suppose, she said, voice shaking. That's what I get for believing men only respected women who played quiet. Hawthorne said nothing as Sergeant Miles stepped into the room behind her. This time, there was no need for tricks. Time, the great deceiver, had finally run out. The air in the drawing room remained taut long after Lady Fenchurch was led away. The others sat in stunned silence, their faces pale in the lamplight. Outside, rain struck the windows with muted fingers, a rhythm far steadier than the beats of any heart inside. Hawthorne watched the door close behind her, but something still nagged. Him an itch beneath the surface of resolution. It should have felt like closure. It didn't. It felt like something had been moved, altered, folded in on itself just enough to warp the picture. He returned to the table where the bundle of cloth still lay open, the brass hands gleaming faintly, the clock from the mantel tampered, the pocket watch planted, 3 fractured timelines, all connected to one woman now in custody. It was enough for the courts, perhaps even enough for the newspapers, but not for Hawthorne. He turned toward Miles. Take that cloth and the hands to the evidence room at once. Lock them under your seal. And I want Reginald's original letter about Wit Command Lady. Fenchurch's journal entry filed the same way. This case isn't closed yet. Miles nodded. Gathering the items. Where will you be, sir? Library, he said. I want one last look at that drawer. He stepped back into the heavy quiet of the library, the scent of old books rising with the warmth of the fire. His fingers drifted once again to the desk, opening the drawer with practiced ease. Still the same rows of papers, the same careful arrangement, only it wasn't the letter. Reginald's final note, the one Iona had discovered, the one he had quoted again and again, was gone. Hawthorne stood still, his pulse quickening. He opened each drawer, searched beneath blotters, inside the hollow of the lamp base, even beneath the chair cushions. Nothing. He called to Miles, who returned empty-handed. The envelope with the hands, Hawthorne asked. Miles frowned, was just about to seal it. It's gone. What do you mean, gone? I turned for a moment. Giles said he wanted to apologize to Danner. I stepped aside. When I looked, again, it wasn't in my hand. "Where's Giles now?" "In the drawing room." Hawthorne didn't wait. He found Giles standing near the decanter tray, his hand visibly shaking as he poured a drink. Danner and Iona sat quietly nearby, both of them watching him not with suspicion, but with something almost like pity. "You have it," Hawthorne said flatly. Giles froze. The decanter tilted, amber liquid spilling down the side. "I don't know what you mean." Hawthorne stepped forward, calm but deadly precise. "The letter, and the clock hands. Where are they?" Don't lie, Giles. You're not good at it." Giles turned, trying to laugh, but it caught in his throat. "You said yourself the killer was Lady Fenchurch. Why does a bit of brass or a melodramatic letter matter now? Because truth isn't a matter of volume. It's a matter of record, and you just tried to rewrite it." Giles's smile cracked. "I wanted it buried," he muttered. "For all our sakes." Hawthorne said nothing, waiting. "She wrote him a letter," Giles went on, "years ago. Threatened to expose my, let's say, financial embellishments. Reginald used it like a leash. Said if I ever crossed him again, he'd make the letter public. Disbar me, ruin me. So yes, I took it, and the clock hands a symbol. That's all. A final damnation she didn't deserve. She did wrong, but she was made by this place just like the rest of us. She shouldn't be reduced to a crime scene footnote." "You're not the arbiter of memory," Hawthorne said. "And if you think removing evidence helps, you're very mistaken." But Giles didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to help her. I'm trying to save what's left of this. The house, the legacy, the family. You tear the whole history open. What will be left? Honesty," Hawthorne replied coldly. "And that's more than what currently stands." He motioned to Miles. "Search him. Search his room. Retrieve both items. I want everything logged, photographed, and sent to the station." Giles didn't resist, but as he was led away, his voice floated behind him. "She wasn't the only one who planned this. That landed like a blade buried just short of bone." Hawthorne turned to Danner. "Did you hear that?" "I did," the doctor said quietly. "But I no longer know who he meant." "I do," Iona said, her voice low. "He meant me." "No," Hawthorne said. "He meant someone else. He meant someone still pretending to be a bystander. Which means this case has two layers. One we just exposed, and one still wrapped in velvet." He moved toward the hearth, eyes scanning the frame, then to the shelves, then, suddenly, to the side cabinet where brandy and cigars were kept. He opened it, and there, among the cut crystal glasses, was a matchbook, plain, gold, embossed with the initials W.C.C. He opened it. Inside, one match had been struck recently, but more telling was what lay tucked behind the flap, a folded square of soft paper. Hawthorne opened it. It was a page torn from a journal. "I must act soon, before Reginald puts pen to the new will. He doesn't know I've already spoken to the notary in York. It must be tomorrow night. Let them all believe it was grief or illness. Let it come like silence. Time will hide me, as it always has. It wasn't Lady Fenchurch's handwriting. It wasn't Giles's. It was Danner's." He turned to the man seated behind him. Danner met his eyes and smiled. "It was a good performance," he said. "Wasn't it?" Hawthorne held Danner's gaze, that half-smile still curving the doctor's mouth, steady as a heartbeat. The matchbook and note trembled faintly in the inspector's grip, their implications roaring louder than any accusation. "You wrote this," Hawthorne said, voice low. Danner didn't flinch. "You're sure? The ink's fresh. The paper matches the journal in your guest room, and the handwriting's identical. You were orchestrating something long before Lady Fenchurch laid her plans." "I was anticipating," Danner said smoothly. "Not orchestrating." "Anticipating what?" "That Reginald wouldn't live to sign the will. You knew someone meant to kill him." "I knew someone had to, for a moment," Hawthorne said. "Nothing." He placed the matchbook carefully on the mantelpiece beside the silent clock and studied the doctor. Danner remained unnervingly still, the fire's glow highlighting the edges of his face, but never quite reaching the eyes. "Where were you?" Hawthorne asked. "At precisely 6:30 that night. I was in the garden, alone, too. Convenient, isn't it?" Danner's smile widened, and now too late to prove otherwise. Before Hawthorne could reply, the door to the hall burst open. Miles stood there, breath shallow, face pale. "Sir," he said, "you'd better come." "What is it?" "Giles." They moved quickly. Down the hall, past the staircase, toward the south wing of the house where the guest rooms lay. A small knot of servants had gathered at one door, their murmurs tense. Miles pushed through and Hawthorne followed. Already knowing what they'd find, Giles lay on the floor beside the bed, his eyes wide and vacant. His shirt was stained with a spreading patch of red. A thin stream of blood had soaked into the carpet beneath him. Beside his outstretched hand was a bottle of brandy untouched. No glass. No weapon. Hawthorne knelt beside the body. Miles stood over him, fists clenched. "We were bringing him in," he said. "I locked him in here while I went to fetch a constable from town. Gave him 10 minutes at most. No one else had the key." Hawthorne looked up. "Where's the key now, Miles?" Patted his coat, then froze. He searched again, more frantically. "It was here. I swear it was here." Hawthorne stood. The lock hadn't been forced. The door hadn't been broken. And yet Giles was dead. Everyone who had access to Miles, Hawthorne said, voice steel, was in that drawing room less than half an hour ago. "Iona, Lady Fenchurch, and Danner," Miles murmured. But Fenchurch was already in custody. "I took her straight to the carriage myself, which left only 2. Hawthorne's eyes snapped to the corridor. "Where's Iona?" No one answered. He turned, heart surging, with urgency, and rushed back through the hall. The drawing room was empty. The fire burned low. The painting above the mantel Pendlebrook, that damn pastoral lie, watched in silence. But Iona was gone. On the small writing desk near the window, a single page lay beneath a paperweight. He strode forward and read. He promised he would end it cleanly. But he lied. Giles was never meant to die. I thought we were exposing Reginald's sins, not replacing them with our own. I won't be complicit anymore. I'm going to stop him before he buries another truth." Miles had followed him in the back entrance. Hawthorne nodded. "Search the grounds. Find the stable boy. Ask if any horses were taken. She won't have gone far, not yet." "What about Danner?" Hawthorne turned toward the library. Each step faster than the last. But when he entered, the chair by the fire was empty. The brandy glass he'd seen earlier was gone. The matchbook to Dot, and on the table, where Danner had been sitting only minutes ago, lay the small brass clock from the mantel. Its hands had been reattached, and it now ticked, softly, steadily. At precisely 7:17. Hawthorne didn't touch it. He simply stared, the significance pressing down like gravity. The time Reginald's death had really occurred. A message, a mockery, or a countdown. He turned on his heel and left the room, the cold wind of realization chasing him down the corridor. Danner was gone. Iona was chasing him, and someone else, a puppet or a partner, was still in motion. Giles hadn't just been silenced. He'd been eliminated. Not because he posed a threat to Iona or Fenchurch, but because he knew Danner too well. This wasn't cleanup. It was escalation. And the final act had just begun. The night wind bit colder as Hawthorne stepped into the manor's east courtyard. His coat flapped against his legs, boots crunching faintly on gravel still slick from the rain. Lanterns bobbed along the hedge paths where Miles and 2 constables now scoured the grounds, calling Iona's name in clipped, worried tones. But she had not gone to flee. That much was clear. She'd gone to stop Danner. And somewhere, out in the darkness, Danner was moving again, confident, methodical, and always just ahead. Hawthorne made for the garden gate, the one that led toward the old stables. The moon broke through low clouds just enough to cast everything in faint silver, including the uneven flagstones near the greenhouse. He passed the fountain and caught a glint of something. Out of place, a muddy heel print crushed deep into the flowerbed border. Small, narrow. Not Danner's. Iona had come this way. He turned left, down the slope toward the stables. The doors were slightly ajar. Inside, the scent of straw and horse oil lingered faintly, along with the distinct musk of wet wool. A saddle was missing. One of the lanterns had been unhooked, but no horse was gone. She hadn't ridden out. She had circled back. Hawthorne paused. He closed his eyes. Why the detour? Why take a lantern from here, if not to light the path forward? He turned, retraced his steps, and crossed toward the west end of the manor toward the disused chapel on the ridge. The old path was barely visible, overgrown and choked with ivy, but it was there, and it led somewhere no one had thought to. Searched. The chapel stood hunched at the hill's crest, its roof bowed with age, its stained glass windows clouded by decades of lichen and moss. The lantern flickered inside, and voices. Hawthorne approached slowly, careful not to crunch gravel underfoot. He reached the warped oak door and pushed it gently, just enough to let the whisper of voices filter through the crack. "I told you." Iona's voice trembled. "It wasn't meant to be like this. You told me you wanted justice." Came Danner's reply, steady, low. "But now you recoil because it finally arrived. Justice wasn't supposed to kill Giles. He knew too much. He endangered the entire plan." "Your plan," she snapped. A pause. Then Danner's voice softened. "My plan, yes, but built from your pain, your memory. I was only the architect. You laid the foundation. I didn't ask you to kill anyone. You asked me to end it. I did." Hawthorne stepped fully into the room. The light flared across both their faces. Iona pale, shaken, with the lantern in one hand, her other balled into a fist. Danner, composed, his coat unbuttoned, a faint trace of red along the inside of one cuff. "And what, exactly?" Hawthorne asked quietly. Danner didn't turn. "Inspector, justice or witnesses? They're often the same. You're running out of space for your rationalizations," Hawthorne said. "And time, on the contrary," Danner said, finally turning. "I've never been closer to clarity." His calm unnerved Hawthorne more than any outburst could have. But it wasn't Danner's certainty that held Hawthorne's attention. It was the stone pedestal behind him. A candle had been lit beside it, and resting beside the flame was something out of place in this sanctuary of dust and damp. A photograph, glossy, recent, a candid image of Reginald Fenchurch and Giles standing in the manor's study. A third man was just visible in the background, blurred, indistinct. But Hawthorne recognized the silhouette. The photograph hadn't been taken casually. It had been planted. That's when it hit him. He looked back at the chapel's doorway, the gravel near the threshold. 3 sets of tracks. Danner, Iona, and someone else lighter, wearing leather-soled boots. Someone who'd entered before the confrontation. Who else was here? Hawthorne asked, gaze narrowing. Danner looked briefly puzzled. No one. Wrong. He stepped toward the pedestal and picked up the photo. "This wasn't brought by either of you." Iona shook her head. "It was here, already, when I arrived. So, someone knew you'd come, knew you'd find each other here. Someone staged the scene." He turned the photo over. Nothing, no mark, no message. Then, on instinct, he lifted the edge of the candle base. Beneath it, folded in half, a single strip of aged vellum. A page torn from a registry, the chapel's own. He unfolded it. Ernest Whitcomb, confession received and witnessed May 3, 1913. Reginald Fenchurch present. Terms of silence agreed. Sealed with personal bond. Good God, Hawthorne breathed. He did confess. Iona whispered, "All these years," but Hawthorne wasn't listening. He read the names again. And suddenly, everything aligned. The photograph. The records. The pattern. The killer wasn't Danner. Not entirely. He had been an instrument, sharp and obedient. But the hand guiding him, manipulating the clock, the clues, the voices had never truly stepped into the light. It was someone who knew the chapel's contents. Someone who had access to sealed archives. Who could move unseen between rooms. Who appeared exactly when needed and disappeared before consequences arrived. Not Fenchurch. Not Giles. Not even Danner. But the one person no one had questioned. Not once. Miles. Hawthorne turned toward the chapel door, a fresh jolt of cold twisting through his spine. "Miles," he said aloud. Iona looked up. What about him? He was the first to arrive at every scene. The first to handle every piece of evidence. The one who lost the key to Giles's room. Who handled the envelope, the journal, even the letter from Reginald. "You think he's involved?" "No," Hawthorne said. "I think he's been ahead of me from the start." He looked at the photo again. And now he saw it, not the third figure, but the angle of the shot. It had been taken from the high gallery in the library, a position only a staff member would know. Only someone always watching. Miles. The pattern had always been about time, but time is only measured when it's observed. And Miles had been observing everything. The detective's pulse surged, not from fear but anticipation. The final piece had just slid into place. Hawthorne stood motionless at the chapel's threshold, the revelation settling around him like a final, bitter frost. Miles always present, always compliant, always one step behind and yet, impossibly, one step ahead, the steward of evidence, the hand that guided events. Without ever appearing to push, the man he had trusted without thought, because trust, like habit, was invisible until broken. He folded the registry slip and tucked it into his coat. "We have to go," he said to Iona, his voice sharp with urgency. "But where? The library first, then the East Wing, if I'm right. He's preparing his exit or his last move." Possibly both. Danner followed without a word, silent as the grave he had nearly dug for others. Guilt now clung to his composure like wet ash, and for the first time, Hawthorne saw the fracture. Danner had believed he was the mastermind, but he had only been the blade. They reached the library within minutes. Nothing appeared out of place, but that was the point. It had never looked out of place. That was Miles's skill, erasure without disturbance. There were no fingerprints, no displaced dust, only the absence of what mattered. Hawthorne crossed to the gallery staircase, 2 steps at a time. The narrow landing overlooked the study floor, and the hearth where that damning photograph had been taken, and behind the carved balustrade, tucked neatly between the bookcases, was a recess, just wide enough to house a camera. It was empty now, but the dust line was fresh. Below, Danner looked up. What was here? A hiding place, Hawthorne murmured. A perch, the eyes behind the curtain. He descended again. "I know where he'll be." The East Wing was quiet. Too quiet. Miles would know how long it took a man to move between rooms, to search, to return. He would have measured every second. They reached the old archive chamber, once a nursery, then converted into Reginald's private records room. The door was closed. Hawthorne didn't hesitate. He pushed it open. Miles stood near the far desk, his coat draped neatly over the chair, his revolver disassembled on the table beside a half-burned envelope. He looked up, not startled, not alarmed, almost relieved. "I wondered how long it would take you," he said. "Longer than it should have," Hawthorne replied. "You're clever, too clever. You never left fingerprints because you were the one collecting them." Miles gave a rueful smile. "You know what the worst part of watching is, Inspector? It's knowing what they really are. Reginald, Giles, even Lady Fenchurch. You see them lie, wound, and smile, and you still bring them tea. Still nod when they dismiss you. Still obey. You could have walked away," Hawthorne said. "Instead, you turned the house into a stage." Miles shook his head. "I didn't want to destroy it. I wanted to reveal it." He opened a drawer slowly and lifted out a bound ledger, thick, worn, the kind used for estate accounts. He opened it to a marked page and laid it flat. "I started this 10 years ago," he said. "Every conversation, every secret, every bribe, every betrayal. They never saw me, so they never knew I saw them." Hawthorne crossed the room cautiously. The pages were filled with tight, orderly handwriting entries marked by date, subject, room. It was a surveillance journal, not out of curiosity, out of purpose. "You documented everyone," Hawthorne said. "All of them. They made me. Every time they made me lie to a guest, hide something for a family member, turn away a girl in tears, patch a broken story so Reginald could keep his reputation." Miles looked up. "I tried to give the truth to the law. No one cared. So, you became judge and jury. I became historian," Miles snapped. "The one person in this house who didn't forget, didn't pretend. Reginald abused his staff and rewrote wills to cover his shame. Fenchurch forged receipts to keep her charities afloat. While bleeding the house dry, Giles, he used the family name to cover debts from racing, women, God knows what else. Even Danner, charming Danner, who returned to collect, not reconcile." Danner flinched. "You don't know me. I know you came with documents for Reginald to sign. Not love, not forgiveness, just leverage." "And what of Iona?" Hawthorne asked. Was she guilty too? Miles looked at her, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Regret. She was the only one I didn't plan for, he said. She believed in justice, even when it was blind. That made her dangerous. You killed Giles, Hawthorne said. Miles didn't deny it. He realized I wasn't just taking notes anymore. He saw me pocket the key and the hands of the brass clock. I removed them weeks ago. Reattached them when I needed the timing to shift. You let Lady Fenchurch take the fall. She earned it, but she wasn't guilty of murder. No, Miles said, but she was guilty of letting one happen. Silence stretched across the room like tensioned wire. Then Hawthorne stepped forward, slowly. You set the fire, too, didn't you? Miles blinked. The stable's fire, 3 nights ago. The one everyone assumed was lightning. He didn't answer. But he didn't need to. You've been erasing their legacy, Hawthorne said. Bit by bit. Not erasing, Miles whispered. Correcting. He reached for the revolver's barrel, but Hawthorne was already there. In one swift motion, he pushed it out of reach and turned the desk lamp full on his face. I didn't come here to shoot you, Miles, he said. I came to end the story. Miles's eyes narrowed. Then tell it correctly. I will, Hawthorne said. But the truth isn't yours to sculpt. It never was. You were the only one who saw clearly, and instead of justice, you chose control. Miles said nothing. The mask had slipped now. Behind it was not madness, not even hatred. Just exhaustion. As Miles was led from the manor in silence, dawn began to pierce the gray horizon. Light filtered through the cracked windows of Pendlebrook for the first time in days. Iona stood beside Hawthorne on the threshold. He wasn't wrong, she murmured. No, Hawthorne replied. Just unforgivable. And behind them, the clock on the mantel ticked on, its hands finely, mercifully, aligned with time once more. Rain slicked the cobblestones again by nightfall. A new storm pressed against the horizon, but inside Pendlebrook, all was eerily still. The once crowded halls had emptied of voices, and the great house, stripped of its secrets, now echoed with a quiet that felt more like aftermath than peace. Hawthorne sat alone in the library, the hearth cold, the brass clock ticking softly once more on the mantel. Its hands were correct now, not just in time, but in purpose. No more misdirection, no more illusions, but there was one thing left, one final act. He leaned forward and lit the desk lamp. Then, with deliberate care, he laid out the ledgers, photographs, and registry slips, the journal entries, the envelope with the tampered clock hands, a dossier of deception, page by damning page, each artifact placed with the exactness of a chessboard trap. Then he waited. The door creaked open at precisely 7. Iona entered, her coat damp from mist. She paused in the doorway, eyes scanning the display on the desk. You said it was urgent, she murmured. It is, he replied, rising slowly. You deserve the truth, all of it. She stepped forward cautiously, the soft rustle of her skirt the only sound besides the steady ticking. I thought we had the truth, she said. We have most of it. He held up a photograph. Not the old candid of Reginald, a new one, from the constable's file. It showed the back of a woman, coat unbuttoned, scarf trailing, leaving the scene of Giles's death. Iona stiffened. It wasn't Miles who opened the door, Hawthorne said. It was you. She didn't move, didn't blink. You have the second key to the guest rooms, he continued. You used it after Miles left. You slipped in, retrieved the journal and the envelope. And I didn't kill Giles, she said quietly. I know. He stepped closer. But you knew someone would. A pause. Then, I warned him. Yes, and you were right. But you still led him into a trap. Her hands clenched. Because he was part of it. He knew about Reginald's blackmail, about Whitcomb. He watched it happen, and did nothing. So you set the match, Hawthorne said, voice low, and let someone else strike it. I had no choice, she said. I trusted you wouldn't stop until you had the truth, but I couldn't be sure you'd see it. Not all of it. So I left the trail where you'd find it. He nodded. You guided me well. You brought me to the chapel. Left the photograph, the confession, even Miles's matchbook. Her eyes met his. He did the killing. I only revealed what should never have been hidden. But you omitted one thing, Hawthorne. said Dot. He moved behind the desk and opened a drawer, drawing out a small tin. Inside were 3 matchbooks, one gold, one blue, one white, each from a different location in the manor, all found in hidden places, all matching Danner's old haunts. Danner didn't stage the photographs, Hawthorne said. You did. From the gallery, Iona didn't answer. You let Danner believe he was in control. You let Miles believe he was the architect. But from the beginning, you were the one placing the pieces, whispering just enough, hiding just enough, stirring just enough. The tension in her shoulders gave way to something else calm. I never meant for it to go so far, she said. But once Giles died, I couldn't undo it. So why didn't you run? I wanted to see if it could end cleanly, if someone could finally say, without compromise, what this house really was. He stepped out from the desk and faced her. It wasn't justice. It was manipulation. Clever, quiet, lethal in the hands of men like Danner or Miles. But you were the fuse, and you lit it, she whispered. He paused. No, he said. I followed it. But now I've reached the end. She turned then slowly, deliberately, and reached into her coat. For a moment, his pulse surged. But it wasn't a weapon she drew. It was Reginald's last letter. The original, not the copy. Untorn, unmarked, she held it out. I've kept it since the night he died, she said. It doesn't incriminate him, not really. But it proves the rest, the cover-up, the silence he demanded. Hawthorne took it, read the lines carefully, then looked at her. What do you want me to do with it? Her voice, at last, cracked. Make it matter. There was a long silence. Then footsteps in the corridor. Miles, escorted by 2 officers. Danner, handcuffed, eyes sunken. The house was emptying for the final time. Hawthorne walked Iona to the threshold, stopping just inside the great foyer where light poured in from the first pale break of dawn. You'll be questioned, he said. Maybe charged. But your confession helps. I'm ready, she said. She looked back one last time. I used to love this place, she said. Before I knew it. He nodded. So did they. She stepped out into the morning, surrendering to whatever came next. And Hawthorne turned back toward the quiet manor, now stripped to truth. The trap had worked, but not because it caught a killer, because it exposed the lie behind them all. The manor was silent, the kind of silence that feels permanent. Rain pattered faintly against the tall windows, a soft percussion that filled the space between memories and ash. The guests had left. The suspects were gone. Iona was in custody. Calm but unreadable, Miles would face trial. Danner, discredited and disarmed, had finally accepted the full weight of his failures. Hawthorne stood once more in the library, where it had all begun. The fire was lit again now, though low, casting dancing shadows across the brass clock and the ghost of Pendlebrook's sins. The pages were filed, the testimonies recorded. The ledger. Miles's damning journal had been handed over to the magistrate. The case was closed. And yet, something tugged at the edges of his mind. Not a scream, not a whisper, just a pause, a single breath of unease. He stared again at the folded confession. Iona had surrendered Reginald's final letter. Its words weren't revelations anymore. They had been sifted and analyzed by both the Crown and Hawthorne's own scrutiny. Still, the tone it nagged at him. Not what it said. How it said it. The phrasing. He reached into his satchel and unfolded the letter again, flattening it under the lamp's glow. His eyes traced each line as they had a dozen times before. But this time, he read with different ears. Their second paragraph. As you once promised to protect the truth, I now pass it back to you, and trust that silence will be your last service. That line so carefully worded. Not a plea, not regret, a command. He pulled out a copy of Reginald's handwriting from a much earlier document, an old estate invoice. From 5 years prior, there was a distinctive curl in the lowercase f, and a pressure-weighted tilt to the R and V, the script in. The confession lacked those flourishes. It looked authentic, but it wasn't his. Not precisely. He set the two side by side and stared. A perfect imitation, but imperfect enough for someone who studied the originals often. And only one person would have had the access, skill, and motive. Not Iona. Not even Miles. His hand hovered over the drawer again, the one where he'd placed A copy of the Manor's staff records. He pulled it out and flipped through until he found the inventory for library maintenance and documentation. There, listed 3 years back, Edith Barrow, archivist and household secretary, a minor figure, seldom mentioned, never seen in any witness lists, but mentioned just once. In a line from Danner's testimony, Barrow keeps the keys to the document vault. She files every page, has for years. He had dismissed her, everyone had. She had retired 6 months ago, they'd said, quietly, without ceremony, moved to a small cottage in Devon. But she'd had everything, all the papers, all the letters, the ledger, possibly even before Miles started writing in it. And if someone wanted to manipulate the entire story without setting foot into the chaos, Barrow had the means to do so. He turned to the fireplace. The clock ticked. The false clock, the one with the removable hands, had been part of the earliest deception. And again, who managed the old household objects? Barrow. The record listed her overseeing the restoration of antique items, including the brass carriage clock. He sat still. A chill swept over him. Was Miles the instrument after all? Was Iona? He stood abruptly, sweeping the letters back into the satchel. He had to know. Had to see her 2 days later. He arrived at a narrow stone cottage overlooking a gray strip of coastline. The door was already open when he approached, propped with a polished boot scraper. Inside, the space was meticulously clean, simple, quiet. Edith Barrow sat at a small table, a cup of tea at her elbow, spectacles folded neatly beside a stack of letters. She looked up as he entered. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. "You knew I would. You're too meticulous to let a forgery go unchallenged." He closed the door. "Why?" She tilted her head. "Because someone had to ensure. The story meant something. Miles was emotional. Iona was reckless. You're methodical. But even you wouldn't understand the layers unless the trail was shaped just right. You forged Reginald's confession," Hawthorne said flatly. "I rewrote what he deserved to say," she corrected. "You framed a man. You let 2 others die." She looked away. "I didn't light the match. I only arranged the kindling." "Why?" She lifted the teacup with both hands. "Because I archived every atrocity in that house for 20 years. Watched them bury. Pain under charm. They would have been forgotten. The truth would have died with Reginald. And history would call him a philanthropist. That couldn't happen. So you manufactured a new truth." "No," she said softly. "I revealed the one they refused to admit." He looked at her for a long moment. A gray-haired woman with calm eyes and quiet fury. A servant in title, a puppeteer in silence. "You're not going to run, are you?" "I've already done what I needed to. If they come for me, I'll answer." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You're right about one thing," he said. "The truth mattered, but not your version." She smiled faintly. "And yet, it's the only one anyone will remember now." Outside, the waves rolled in slowly, endlessly. Hawthorne stood alone on the path for a long time, the satchel heavy at his side. The case was closed. But justice had always been a matter of perspective. The sky above Devon burned with a washed-out orange by the time Hawthorne returned to the small inn where he'd taken a room. The sea stretched out beneath the horizon, heavy and quiet. The conversation with Edith Barrow played over in his mind like the turning of a slow, rusted key. Her words hadn't shaken him. They'd confirmed what he'd already known. But they hadn't satisfied him either. The truth, now fully uncovered, still left an echo, a question unresolved. He lit the oil lamp in his room and laid out the satchel's contents on the small desk. Reginald's false confession, Miles's meticulous ledger, the matchbooks, the photographs, the torn letter that had never been torn. The evidence was now complete, but strangely, the satisfaction of closure never came. Perhaps that was the point. Still, there were things to be said, a record to make clear. He opened his notebook and began to write, detailing the final chain of events. It had started with the clock with hands set to midnight, yet a mechanism untouched, a psychological signal, not a time of death, but a promise that something buried would rise at last. It continued with Giles, whose death was no accident of panic or passion. He had known too much, perhaps suspected Barrow's manipulations, and tried to confront Miles about them. It wasn't just that he had been silenced, it was that he had been guided toward his fate by clues too perfectly laid. The journal left visible, the letter waiting, the confrontation timed. Barrow hadn't acted out of impulse. Every step had been rehearsed, choreographed in silence. She had known whom to provoke, and when. She had exploited Miles's bitterness, letting him feel like a righteous avenger while keeping him firmly in her palm. When Iona's fury surfaced, Barrow let it bloom just enough, directing her not with words but with opportunity. Even Danner, proud and slick, had danced to the same strings. No one saw the old secretary as a threat. That was her masterpiece. And then the trap for Hawthorne himself, documents planted, clues arranged, not to deceive, but to teach, to force him to see how fragile the line between justice and narrative could be. He paused, considering that line. Justice, the word rang hollow. Now, he reached for the final slip, the handwriting comparison between Reginald and Barrow's forgery. That was what had cracked it open, that single-minute flourish of an F missing. That was the truth's pressure point. So he wrote it into his report, because someone needed to see it, even if courts would never charge Barrow, even if she never stood trial. She had built her justice not in courtrooms but in memory. The following week, back in London, the official inquiry convened. Miles was declared guilty of Giles's murder, though his mental state clearly unstable. Corrupted by years of quiet resentment and manipulation softened his sentencing. He would serve time in a secure institution, his mind picked over by men in coats with pens. While the public forgot his name, Danner was cleared of direct involvement in the crimes but permanently barred from holding any professional estate or trust responsibility again. He vanished into a quiet life in Dorset, far from Pendlebrook's shadow. Iona stood trial not for murder, but for obstruction. Hawthorne testified in her defense. Her role, while significant, was ruled as coerced by circumstance and grief. She received probation and left London within days of her release, refusing interviews, letters, or public notice. But Edith Barrow, she was never summoned. No indictment was brought. Hawthorne had presented the evidence calmly, thoroughly. He'd shown the forged letter, the handwriting comparison, the dates of her access. But there was nothing explicit to tie her hand to the fire, only influence, only thought. And in the eyes of the law, thought was not crime. She remained in her cottage, occasionally seen in the market, always polite, always solitary. Hawthorne visited once more. Months later, not to press, only to speak. She greeted him with the same quiet poise, the same neat parlor, the same sense that she had already accepted every possible outcome. "Will you ever write your side?" he asked. "I already did," she said. "You just haven't recognized it yet." "You mean the ledger?" "No," she said with a faint smile. "The story you told. The one you wrote. That was mine, too." He said nothing. On his way out, he noticed the brass clock on her mantel. Its hands were missing. She didn't need to mark time anymore. Back in London, Hawthorne closed the file with a quiet click. He had solved every riddle, unmasked every layer, proved every twist with evidence. But still, the brass clock ticked in his memory not just as a symbol of guilt, or justice, or truth, but as a reminder that some stories don't end with arrests. They end with understanding. And sometimes, that was the harder sentence to serve. The train from Devon hummed steadily as it curved through the outskirts of London, its rhythm like the ticking of the brass clock that had haunted Hawthorne through the weeks outside. Dawn blurred the glass with streaks of rose and ash, and inside his compartment, the detective sat alone, coat collar turned up, fingers loosely clasped around a cooling cup of tea. The file on Pendlebrook lay shut in his satchel, sealed, signed, and submitted to the Crown Office. Justice, in the official sense, had been served, or approximated, or perhaps just archived, like so many other uncomfortable truths. But the weight in his chest hadn't shifted. He turned over Barrow's words again, that final conversation. "You just haven't recognized it yet." A warning, a provocation, or perhaps something simpler, a clue he'd failed to name. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded scrap she'd handed him just before he'd left. Not evidence, just a note. She'd said it was something she found in Reginald's study drawer, after the investigation ended, said it was meant for posterity. She hadn't opened it, or claimed not to. He unfolded it slowly. Inside, in Reginald's sharp, distinctive hand, were only 6 words. The clock was never meant to. No signature, no date, no context, just the sentence. The train lurched gently as it slowed into Paddington, but Hawthorne barely noticed. His eyes narrowed on the slip of paper, the phrasing. It echoed something. He reached for his notebook and flipped back through the pages until he found the original inventory notes on the brass carriage clock. Manufactured in 1891, gifted to the estate in 1902, last serviced by a local horologist, George Lennox, according to estate records in 1937. He frowned. That name, not because it meant anything on its own, but because he had seen it again. He flipped further back to his sketch of Miles's ledger. In the margin of one page, just beneath an entry dated February 14th, Miles had scrawled a cryptic line. Lennox's correction holds the face must lie. Hawthorne's breath caught. He hadn't understood it then, had assumed it referred to a faulty dial or symbolic flourish. But now he pulled out the old photograph of the brass clock on Pendlebrook's mantel. He had studied it so many times for fingerprints, blood flecks, tool marks, but he had never truly studied the design. Now he saw it. The numerals were subtly misaligned, almost imperceptibly. The 10 leaned a fraction to far inward. The 3 sat lower than its axis. The hands had been removed and replaced multiple times. But it wasn't where it was intentional. He remembered now one of the first statements from Miles when questioned about the clock. It's not broken, sir, just decorative. But what if it wasn't? He reached again for Barrow's last file, the staff rota from Pendlebrook's early days. Hidden among the names was a line-item entry for an invoice. Consultation Lennox. Horological irregularity, 1946, decades after the clock had last been repaired. Why consult a horologist for a clock that no longer functioned? Unless, he pressed his fingers against his brow. What if the clock had never been a timepiece at all? What if it had always been a cipher? He leaned back slowly, piecing it together. A clock whose hands pointed at odd hours, a ledger referencing lies, a forgery timed to mislead. The words of Reginald's final note, the clock was never meant to warrant. About timekeping. They were about meaning. The object had been there not to tell time, but to encode it. The positions of the hands, midnight, the absence of sound, the hollow cavity discovered behind the mechanism. It wasn't just where Miles had hidden a photograph. It was where something else had been buried, or left. He remembered the constable's offhand report. During the search, a thin metal disc had been removed from behind the clock, face discarded as part of the mechanism. No one had claimed it. It hadn't been photographed. He hadn't thought to question it. Why would he? It had been catalogued and filed with the rest of the debris. But now he realized that disc had been the key, possibly a cipher wheel, possibly a key to a different lock, an external safe, or a document vault somewhere within the estate, perhaps even connected to a broader ledger Barrow hadn't revealed. The train slowed again as it slid into the final approach, brakes hissing like steam. The platform outside bustled with umbrellas and overcoats, but Hawthorne didn't move to stand. His hand hovered over the slip of Reginald's handwriting, the 6 maddening words looping in his mind. The clock was never meant to. He folded it gently, slid it back into his pocket, and rose. The case, it seemed, was not yet done. Not fully, for all his care, all his method, all the evidence and argument and interviews. Something had slipped past him. Something Barrow had slipped past him, not to obstruct him, to test him. And the worst part, she had succeeded. As he stepped down onto the platform, the rain finally stopped. Just for a moment, a break in the sky. The light turned soft, then golden. He tightened his coat and walked toward the cab queue, mind already racing. Somewhere in the shadows of Pendlebrook, another mystery waited. Not a murder, not a lie, a message. And Hawthorne intended to read it, even if the clock no longer ticked.